Hi, folks. My name is J.M. Erlinson. I'm a transformation engineering lead here at Software AG and a specialist in the ARIS platform. And today we're doing another one of our videos called Help, I'm an ARIS admin, how to support your first ARIS project or instance. Today's topic, in this particular video, is going to focus on user and user group administration and management. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to get the first users and user groups set up in your environment. If you've watched a couple of videos before, you'll see we have our database, we have a folder structure, and now we're going to bring people onto this environment and give them the right permissions to allow them to see the right things, change the right things, and ultimately interact in the way that we'd like. Now, this is going to require that you have the system admin license, which you should have already, and that you have both access to ARIS Connect and ARIS Architect, because we are going to be using both to do a little bit different things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look through the ARIS Connect administration menu for user management. And I'll explain some of the common privileges you might want to give people, or ones you might want to avoid, and feel free to look through the other ones yourself. So you click on your name, or it could be system administrator, click on administration. And then over here, where it looks like sort of three people clustered together, you'll get to the user management menu. The first thing we're going to do is figure out what permissions we can allocate to people in this menu. We're not going to get down to the granular permissions that we're going to see in ARIS Architect. Right now, we're looking at the sort of course level permissions. And that's by clicking on privileges, we'll see three different menus. I'm not going to go through all of these. Feel free to hover over them. They each sort of say what they do at a high level. And there's more detailed documentation in the ARIS user manual. I just want to talk about the ones that are pretty important for what you might be looking at for your first set of users. The first is if you have the permission, you have ARIS Aware for dashboarding, you're going to want to give dashboard administration to people to allow them to create, manage, and use their dashboards. That's pretty important. Second thing to do is to avoid the database administrator privilege. This one gives people the ability to manage databases, backing up and restoring and stuff like that. But most importantly, this gives them the system user privilege in all databases. That means system user is essentially read, write, delete, version, comment, all the things you can have as permissions in every single database in your tenant, which it's too much for any user. They shouldn't have that level of privilege. You're going to want to be more granular with it. Third thing to know is about document administrator. If you have a bunch of documents in ARIS document storage, you probably want to select one or more people, either by domain or as a sub-administrator in a center of excellence, to be able to help manage the documents that are coming in and out. Those are pretty. This also manages sort of the permissions and structures on who can see which documents in ARIS document storage. Portal administration is really important. We'll actually use that particular privilege in a later on video to design how the portal looks. So where what menu panes are available where people can click to get information, what sort of stuff shows up when they click on it. That's really important. And that's going to take a little bit of control. The script administrator is pretty important. That's anyone who's going to be able to create reports. So, start with you as a system administrator, but also anyone who you want to have as a sub-administrator or domain administrator or architect. Reporting is actually a pretty sort of bread and butter feature for the platform, particularly if you're creating, configuring, and custom reports for different stakeholders based on your business line. They'll need script administration privileges to access the script administration menu. And lastly, we're talking about user administrator. So as a note for you in ARIS, the permissions you're allowed to allocate are only up to the level that you have. So don't worry about giving user administration privileges to somebody as a domain architect. They can't ever give anyone more than their own privileges. So they have access only to their business domain, and they only have read access to other domains. Well, they can't give any of their sub-users write access to it. So we have a built-in control to make sure that people can't over-allocate privileges. And I did say this was the last, but there's one more thing we do need for ourselves for one of our subsequent videos, configuration administration. That's going to be the method filter that we're going to look at on sort of controlling the models and objects that people can use to interact with the environment. Once again, you're probably not going to want to give this to a lot of people. This is going to be also something that happens infrequently when you're changing your method, a little bit faster at the beginning, but then it should peter out pretty quickly. But it is important to know that that's a privilege that someone will need to access the configuration menu, and that's an ARIS Architect. The next pane is license privileges. This is more on on the licenses you've purchased from Software AG, what you have in your environment. But you're going to be allocating users and user groups permissions to access different platforms. So the Aeris Architect tool, you can launch it or not launch it based off of whether or not you have the architect privilege. And then Connect designers and viewers. Now, as I note, if I open up this, you can see that there are some extension packs. Particularly important, the Connect Viewer Contribution Extension Pack is the one that allows them to access things as a contributor. It seems obvious, but the contributor actually allows them, subject matter experts, to use the overview panes of models as form fields to enter information in. That's going to be really important if you've sort of tiered your users by designers and then subject matter experts and then viewers. And that's something you're going to want to allocate to the users and user groups. And lastly, database privileges, we're not going to talk about a lot in this one, in this part, because I'm going to do that more in Aeris Architect. This is where you assign very coarse database privileges, as in I can say, I want to edit the whole database. So you get to see everything, or you get to write everywhere, or you get to version everywhere. It's a very coarse privilege. And generally, I don't use this very much to allocate privileges because you want to be more specific. So with those privileges in mind, now you know what we have. I'm going to actually go to users and user groups. Now you can create users here. Like a perfect example is my just username, which is example user. And I'm going to give them first name, example, and last name, user. And give them an email address. It's important to fill out the email addresses of your users. So my own email address here. And the reason for that is you want to make sure you have people getting the right emails from the Aeris system. There's a lot of things that the email address will do for you. The first is that it will give you access to things like notifications from governance tasks. The other thing it will do is it will give you access to things like collaborations and posts and flags and things like that. You're going to want to give people an email address. And you can specify an initial password for people. I tend to do that because it means that you can just sort of send them here's what your initial password is. They can come in and change it. But if you don't, they're going to get just a link that takes them into Aeris and they have to specify their own password. Language for notifications will be set to your default language off the bat. Although if you're not certain what that is, you can simply select the language that's most relevant for you. Now, once you create a user, you're going to see that you can associate them to user groups, give them different privileges. You can write attributes about them if you have certain attributes you're capturing about users. And you can see I sort of check or uncheck any of these boxes to directly grant a user these privileges. Now, I say directly grant a user these privileges because it's really important to know that those users have the ability to be both granted directly or granted by user group through passing on permissions. Normally, when I'm looking at a larger enterprise deployment or even a medium to large size team, I'm doing all my permissions allocations via user group. That lets me quickly allocate and deallocate people to permissions in like large swaths, large sets, because individual granting of permissions tends to be a little bit more A, time consuming, and B, you'll just forget who has access to what. You have to go into each particular account to get it. But you can, as I said, grant it here. Once again, you can grant all license privileges. You can grant database privileges here as well to individuals. But what I generally do is I go over here and create user groups. So I'm going to click on user groups. Top right, I'm going to add the add user group. And I'm going to create example group over here. And you can give it a description if you really want. And I'm going to add privileges to that. So I'm going to say that this example group has access to Aeris Connect Designer. They can make dashboards. And that's it. And I'm not going to allocate them database privileges yet. And I don't need any function privileges, except for I'm actually going to give them that sort of dashboard administrator privilege where they can manage that visual content. As I know, I can also give them something if you are using the UML methodology. This is an important one to check, but this is not as quite as common, particularly for starting out instances. Next, I'm going to give them users. So this example group, I'm going to go over, and by the way, every time you unclick something or click something, it automatically saves it, so you don't have to worry about like, wait, hey, where do I hit save? Over here and edit my assignments. I've got a bunch of users here, including example user. So I'll check them, hit add, and then hit OK. You'll see that example user will be now allocated to that user group. Let's go back over here and take a look at example user. You can see now that the privileges they have, you can see via user group, they've been made a dashboard administrator, and via user group, they have access to Aeris Connect Designer. Now, still no database privileges. We're going to go into Aeris Architect for that right now. So For that, launch your ARIS Architect, which we talked about before by hitting download clients on the top right side. And now we're going to go over here to my ARIS environment. Now, one of the things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to allocate those users and user groups to granular permissions. And remember we talked about before in a previous video how I've segmented out my processes by business domains or work teams. That's how I'm going to segment out my privileges as well. So I'm going to go over here to ARIS and on the top left side and click Administration. That's where we're going to spend a lot of our time in these videos. In the Administration menu, there's a lot of things over here, some of which I've mentioned before, like configuration, where we need the configuration admin privilege to get in. But I'm actually going to click into my database, into administration. You see that now it drops down a list of user groups and users. I'm clicking on user groups. I can go in and I can see all the different user groups that have access or don't have access to the database. And right-clicking on example group will allow me to assign access privileges, specify publishing settings, those sorts of things. I always tend to go to properties. That's a whole menu that comes up lots of options for you. So a perfect example is I'm not actually assigning access privileges at the whole database level. You can see now I can actually drill through the group structure of my environment and be more granular. In this case, the way I'm going to allocate privileges to this particular user group is as an example group of designers. They're part of business domain 1. So I'm going to give them read, write, delete, and version, the full Monty. They can do everything with business domain 1 that they want. They can read all of the processes. That's fine. I'm going to say they can read the processes of our friends in business domain 2, but they can't in work team 1. That one's going to be kept private to them, so they can see what's going on in other business domains, but they can't see what's happening in the work team. And lastly, I'm going to go over to my library. Remember we talked about this before. The library is where you're going to keep all your protected stuff, the reusable knowledge objects. I want to give them read access, but I'm actually going to give them read comment access. Note that I don't want people chirping on each other's processes, but I do want people to give feedback to my library. And that means they can access the collaboration interface about the particular objects in my library and give me feedback in case that I want to have an interaction between the architects and the designers. So this is how I might allocate these privileges. And that's how I normally started out, by giving certain people certain access to, sort of control one area, but then have read access to the other stuff that they can work on. As a note, I can add more function privileges if I wanted to the people in this properties menu. The other thing is I can choose the method filter they have access to. We're going to talk about that in a subsequent video about method filters. This is where I get sort of down into the weeds on what these people can see. So I'm actually going to allocate this demo filter to them, which we're going to look at in a later video that I'm going to be modifying. That one's going to be a subset of all the possible models, objects, and connections that you're allowed to use, pared down so that this example group has a smaller number of possibilities. Makes it easier for people to get started on the right foot. And so make sure to allocate a method filter to them. And you're going to want to create or modify your method filter, which we'll do in a subsequent video, before you necessarily release them to the world. But it is a good way of sort of controlling and paring down what they can do. And okay. And now you've created this example user, you've created the example group. The example user has now got an email. Because I actually got an email we were talking with a little bit of an initialization link that will help me get to my my environment and initialize my user. So this is what I have to do: ARIS Connect, ARIS Architect, set up your users and user groups, give them the permissions and privileges they need. And that doesn't take very long. It's a pretty simple and fast process, but you're ready to go. Now you've got your user and you can just continue to go through that. Now, once you get your user group, you can just continue to create a whole bunch of users and just allocate them to the user group one at a time. Or as you saw before, I can allocate in a menu more than one person. I can just keep adding users to a user group however I want. So fast and easy. Once again, my name is J.M. Erlandson. Please leave feedback, give comments on these videos. We love hearing from the community of amazing ARIS professionals or ARIS professionals to be. And thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you in the next one.